It was a cold, quiet night when everything changed for Elena. She had been married to Adam for 5 years, but behind closed doors, their marriage was far from happy. What seemed like a normal relationship on the outside was filled with pain and fear. Adam controlled every part of Elena's life, and his anger often turned violent. For years, she suffered in silence, hiding the bruises and emotional scars, not wanting to cause trouble. But that silence would soon be broken in the most unexpected way. One night, after yet another argument escalated into violence, Elena's brother, Isaac, arrived at the house. He had heard enough about the abuse and couldn't stand by anymore. The moment Isaac walked into the house, the tension was clear. Adam didn't back down, and a violent confrontation followed. In the end, Adam lay dead, and Isaac was left holding the weight of his actions. This true crime story dives into the tragic consequences of abuse, where family loyalty and desperation led to a deadly encounter. As the investigation unfolds, it becomes clear that this wasn't just a case of an argument gone wrong. It was years of pain and suffering coming to a boiling point. What drove Isaac to take the life of his sister's husband? And how did Elena's cries for help remain unheard for so long? Keep watching as we uncover the chilling details of this heartbreaking story, where one brother's protective instincts led to a tragic end and a family's life changed forever. It started as a day like any other for Elena, but behind the closed doors of her home, her life was far from normal. Her marriage to Adam had always been tense, but over the years, the tension had turned into something much darker. What had once been small disagreements soon escalated into a pattern of control and abuse. Adam had a temper, and that temper often led to violent outbursts. Elena found herself living in constant fear, unsure of when he might lash out again. She hid her pain from the outside world, covering her bruises and pretending that everything was fine. For years, Elena stayed silent, hoping that things would get better, but they never did. Every argument seemed worse than the last, and Adam's control over her life grew tighter. He monitored where she went, who she spoke to, and even what she wore. It wasn't just the physical abuse that weighed heavily on Elena. It was the emotional manipulation that made her feel like there was no way out. She wanted to leave, but the fear of what Adam might do if she tried kept her trapped. Elena's only source of comfort was her brother, Isaac. They had always been close growing up, and though she tried to keep him in the dark about the full extent of her troubles, Isaac could sense that something wasn't right. Every time they spoke, he could hear the strain in her voice, the exhaustion in her words. He tried to get her to open up, but Elena always assured him that she was handling it, not wanting to burden him with her problems. However, one evening, things took a turn that would change their lives forever. Elena had been at home when Adam returned from work in a foul mood. It didn't take long for the argument to begin, and soon, the shouting turned to violence. Elena knew this was one of Adam's worst outbursts yet, and she feared for her life. As she cowered in the corner of their living room, trying to protect herself from his blows, something inside her snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. In a moment of desperation, Elena reached for her phone and called Isaac. Her brother answered almost immediately, his voice filled with concern as he heard the panic in her voice. Without hesitation, Isaac told her he was coming over, and within minutes, he was on his way to her house. He had always been protective of his sister, and now that he knew she was in danger, nothing was going to stop him from helping her. When Isaac arrived at the house, the front door was slightly ajar. His heart raced as he pushed it open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Adam stood over Elena, his hand raised as if he was about to strike her again. Isaac didn't think. He acted. He charged at Adam, knocking him away from Elena and sending him crashing into the wall. The two men grappled, their anger and adrenaline fueling the violent confrontation. Isaac had always been the more physically imposing of the two, and despite Adam's rage, he quickly found himself overpowered. In the heat of the moment, Isaac grabbed a heavy object, a vase sitting on the nearby table, and swung it at Adam. The impact was immediate, and Adam collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around his head. The room fell silent. Isaac stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Elena, still shaking from the ordeal, crawled over to Adam's body, her mind unable to process what had just taken place. In the span of a few short minutes, everything had changed. The man who had tormented her for years was dead, and her brother, the only person she had left to rely on, was responsible for his death. The shock of the situation hung in the air as both siblings tried to come to terms with what had just happened. Isaac, breathing heavily, looked down at his hand, still gripping the now bloody vase. He hadn't meant for it to end this way, but there was no taking it back. Adam was gone, and the consequences of that moment would soon catch up with them. As the initial shock began to wear off, reality set in. They had to call the police. There was no other option. Isaac knew that he couldn't leave the scene, and Elena, though shaken, understood that the authorities would soon be involved. Together, they made the call, their voices trembling as they explained what had happened. When the police arrived, they found Isaac sitting quietly next to Elena, the both of them too stunned to speak. Detective Harper was the first to enter the room, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He had seen many domestic disturbances in his years on the force, but this one was different. The violence, the desperation in the air, it all told a story that went far deeper than what he could see at first glance. As the investigation began, it became clear that this was no ordinary case of manslaughter. Adam's history of abuse, the years of torment Elena had suffered, and the circumstances leading to his death would all come into question. Isaac had acted in the heat of the moment, but now he faced the possibility of a lifetime behind bars for killing his sister's husband. The police arrived quickly after Isaac and Elena made the call, and the scene was secured. Adam's lifeless body lay on the living room floor, a dark pool of blood surrounding his head where the vase had struck him. Isaac, still in shock, sat beside Elena, who was trembling and unable to speak. The once peaceful house was now the setting of a horrific crime, and Detective Harper was called to lead the investigation. Detective Harper had been with the department for over 20 years, and he had seen countless domestic violence cases. But something about this one felt particularly heavy. As he walked into the house, his eyes immediately scanned the scene. The broken vase, the blood on Isaac's hands, and Elena's tear-streaked face all pointed to the fact that something had gone terribly wrong that night. He approached Isaac first, asking him to recount what had happened. Isaac, though dazed, managed to give a straightforward explanation of the events leading up to the murder. He admitted that he had come to the house after Elena called him in a panic, and when he saw Adam about to hit her again, he reacted. He told Detective Harper that he never meant to kill Adam, but in the heat of the moment, he grabbed the vase and struck him. It was self-defense, he explained, an attempt to protect his sister from further harm. Elena, still shaking, confirmed Isaac's account. She detailed the years of abuse she had endured at Adam's hands, the emotional and physical torment that had left her feeling helpless. She explained how that night had been the worst of all, with Adam threatening her life in a fit of rage. Elena had called her brother because she didn't know what else to do. She had feared for her life, and Isaac's arrival felt like her only chance of escape. Detective Harper listened carefully, his mind piecing together the events. On the surface, it seemed like a clear case of self-defense. Isaac had acted to protect his sister from an abusive man, but something still didn't sit right with Harper. He had been in this job long enough to know that emotions, especially in family dynamics, often clouded the full truth. He needed more information before he could determine whether this was truly self-defense or if there was something more sinister at play. The forensic team arrived and began processing the crime scene, carefully documenting every detail. Blood samples were taken, the broken vase was collected as evidence, and photographs were taken from every angle of the room. Detective Harper knew that these pieces of evidence would be critical in piecing together the full story. He couldn't rely solely on Isaac's and Elena's testimony. He needed the hard facts to back up what had happened. As the investigation progressed, the police interviewed the neighbors. Most of them said the same thing. They had heard shouting from the house before, but no one had ever called the authorities. Elena and Adam's arguments were well known in the neighborhood, but people had largely turned a blind eye, assuming it was just another couple going through a rough patch. However, a few neighbors mentioned seeing Elena with bruises on more than one occasion, which added weight to her claims of long-term abuse. Detective Harper also decided to dig deeper into Adam's past. He had no criminal record, but there were rumors that this wasn't the first time he had been violent in a relationship. Interviews with some of Adam's former co-workers revealed that he had a reputation for being controlling, especially with women. Some recalled seeing him lose his temper at work, though no one had ever thought it would lead to something this tragic. As the pieces of the puzzle started coming together, Detective Harper turned his attention back to Isaac. He needed to understand the full extent of Isaac's involvement. Did Isaac simply act out of rage in the heat of the moment, or had he planned to confront Adam that night? Harper questioned Isaac again, this time asking more detailed questions about his mindset when he entered the house. Isaac maintained that he had no intention of killing Adam. He insisted that his only goal was to stop Adam from hurting Elena. He explained that when he saw Adam about to strike his sister, all he could think about was protecting her. He reached for the closest object, the vase, and hit Adam without thinking of the consequences. It was an instinctual response born out of years of watching his sister suffer. Elena, too, stood by her brother. She tearfully told Detective Harper that Isaac had saved her life. She believed that if he hadn't arrived when he did, Adam would have seriously hurt or even killed her. Elena's account of the abuse was backed up by medical records, showing previous injuries, including a fractured rib and several bruises over the years. There was little doubt that she had been living in fear of her husband for a long time. But despite the overwhelming evidence of Adam's abuse, Detective Harper still had to follow the legal process. Isaac had killed a man, and whether or not it was out of protection, the law required an investigation into whether his actions were justified. Harper knew that this case was complicated. Domestic violence cases often were. It wasn't just about what had happened that night. It was about the years of pain, fear, and desperation that had led to that moment. As the investigation continued, Isaac was placed under arrest for the murder of Adam. Though he had acted to protect his sister, the legal system required that his case be thoroughly examined in court. Isaac cooperated fully with the police, understanding that what he had done, though unintended, had resulted in someone's death. Elena, devastated by the loss of her husband and the arrest of her brother, struggled to cope with the reality of the situation. The community, once unaware of the darkness that existed in Elena's home, was now fully engaged in the case. Neighbors who had once ignored the signs of trouble began to reflect on their own inaction. Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had stepped in sooner? The questions lingered as the legal process moved forward. As Isaac was placed in custody and the investigation continued, the legal system slowly began to unravel the complexities of the case. Both Isaac and Elena were thrust into the spotlight, not only by the legal proceedings but also by the sudden attention from the community and media. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what had happened that night, but the facts of the case were still coming together. Isaac's arrest had been expected by Detective Harper, but the situation was not as straightforward as other homicide cases he had worked on. The circumstances surrounding Adam's death were deeply rooted in years of domestic abuse, and the defense for Isaac began to build around this fact. He had not entered the house that night with the intention of killing Adam, but rather to protect his sister from imminent harm. However, the law required that the case be heard in court, and Isaac now faced a serious murder charge. Elena was heartbroken. She had lost her husband, and though she had lived in fear of him for years, the grief still consumed her. On top of that, her brother was facing the possibility of life in prison. She felt trapped, as though no matter which way the case unfolded, her family was falling apart. The lawyers told her to prepare for a long, difficult trial, and Elena's own testimony would become critical in shaping the outcome. As the court date approached, Isaac's defense attorney focused on gathering evidence that would support the claim of self-defense. Elena's medical records, showing injuries sustained over the years of her marriage, became a crucial part of the case. Bruises, broken bones, and hospital visits, all documented, painted a picture of a woman trapped in an abusive relationship. The defense argued that Isaac's actions, though tragic, were necessary to save Elena's life that night. Detective Harper, who had initially been skeptical, began to see the deeper layers of the case. His interviews with friends, neighbors, and even Adam's coworkers revealed a man who had a violent temper and a history of controlling behavior. Harper discovered that Adam had alienated many people in his life, and some even hinted that they weren't surprised by how things had ended. Still, Harper knew that the justice system didn't work on personal opinions. He needed hard evidence, and the forensic reports, witness statements, and medical records would be the backbone of this trial. The prosecution, on the other hand, wasn't ready to let Isaac off so easily. They argued that while Adam may have been abusive, Isaac had crossed a line that night. Killing a man, even in defense of someone else, required certain legal standards to be met. They planned to argue that Isaac could have intervened without taking Adam's life, that there were other ways to handle the situation. They also brought up the fact that Isaac had grabbed a weapon, the vase. During the confrontation, which they claimed suggested more than just an impulsive action. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. On one side, Elena sat quietly, her hands trembling as she faced the man who had controlled and abused her for so long, now gone forever. On the other side, Isaac sat beside his lawyer, his face a mix of fear and determination. He knew what he had done, and though he never intended for Adam to die, he also knew that he had acted to protect his sister. Still, the weight of the situation bore down on him heavily. The first few days of the trial were focused on establishing the facts. The prosecution laid out their argument, pointing to the crime scene photos, the broken vase, and Isaac's own admission that he had struck Adam. They played up the idea that while Isaac may have acted out of anger or fear, the act of killing Adam could not be justified as self-defense. They painted a picture of a violent confrontation that could have been stopped before it led to a fatal outcome. Isaac's defense team countered with a detailed account of the years of abuse Elena had suffered. They called doctors and domestic violence experts to the stand, all of whom testified to the effects of long-term abuse and the psychological toll it takes on victims. They explained how abuse can trap a person, making it nearly impossible for them to escape without help. Elena, they argued, had been living in fear for years, and Isaac had done what any protective brother would have done in that situation. Elena herself took the stand, and her testimony was the turning point in the trial. She recounted the years of abuse, the constant fear, and the helplessness she felt every day. She described the night of Adam's death in vivid detail, explaining how she had feared for her life, and how Isaac's intervention had been the only thing that saved her. Her words were powerful, and as she spoke, the courtroom fell silent. Even those who had doubted her story began to see the reality of what she had endured. As the trial continued, both sides presented their final arguments. The prosecution insisted that while Adam's actions had been wrong, Isaac had no right to take matters into his own hands in such a violent way. They urged the jury to focus on the law, not the emotions surrounding the case. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded with the jury to see the case for what it was: an act of desperation, a brother stepping in to save his sister from a man who had terrorized her for years. The jury was left with a difficult decision. The law was clear, but so were the circumstances that had led to Adam's death. As they deliberated, the weight of their responsibility became clear. They weren't just deciding Isaac's fate. They were deciding how the justice system would handle cases of domestic violence, self-defense, and family loyalty. As the trial drew to a close, both the defense and prosecution rested their cases, leaving the jury to deliberate Isaac's fate. The courtroom was tense, with Elena and Isaac's family on one side, and Adam's remaining family members on the other. For weeks, they had all sat through the emotional roller coaster of the trial, listening to the details of Adam's abuse and the fateful night that led to his death. The jury was faced with a complicated decision. While the defense had painted Isaac as a protector who had acted in the heat of the moment to save his sister from further harm, the prosecution maintained that Isaac's actions had crossed a line. Isaac had, after all, killed a man, and the law required that they consider the full weight of that action. Was it self-defense or something more deliberate? Inside the jury room, the 12 jurors debated Isaac's intentions that night. Some felt that Isaac had no choice but to act to save his sister from an escalating situation of violence. They empathized with the years of abuse that Elena had suffered, believing that Isaac's intervention, while tragic, was necessary to prevent Adam from causing even more harm. Others, however, struggled with the fact that Isaac had used a weapon, a vase, to kill. They questioned whether Isaac could have handled the situation differently, perhaps subduing Adam without resorting to such fatal force. The hours dragged on as the jury continued to deliberate. They reviewed the evidence presented during the trial, the forensic analysis of the crime scene, the testimonies from Elena's doctors, and the expert witnesses who had spoken about the psychological effects of domestic violence. They also revisited the legal definition of self-defense, trying to apply it to the events that had unfolded on that fateful night. Outside the courtroom, Elena sat anxiously with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She knew that the jury's decision would change her life forever. If Isaac were found guilty, he could face a long prison sentence. A thought that filled her with guilt and sorrow. After everything she had been through with Adam, losing her brother felt like a second tragedy waiting to happen. She couldn't bear the thought of Isaac paying such a heavy price for protecting her. Meanwhile, the prosecution remained confident that the law was on their side. They believed they had successfully demonstrated that Isaac's actions, while driven by emotion, had gone too far. To them, the issue wasn't whether Adam had been abusive or if Elena had suffered. It was about Isaac's decision to take the law into his own hands in such a violent manner. As the jury continued to debate, the weight of their responsibility became even clearer. This wasn't just about Isaac's fate. It was about how the legal system should treat cases involving domestic violence and self-defense. Many of the jurors were torn between following the strict letter of the law and recognizing the unique circumstances that had led Isaac to act the way he did. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the judge called everyone back in, and the tension was palpable as the jury filed back into their seats. Elena gripped the armrest of her chair, her heart racing as she waited for the foreman to read the decision. The judge asked the foreman to deliver the verdict, and after a brief pause, the jury's decision was revealed. Isaac was found not guilty of murder, but was convicted of a lesser charge, manslaughter. The jury had decided that while Isaac had not acted with malicious intent, his actions had still resulted in Adam's death, and for that, there had to be consequences. For Isaac, the verdict was bittersweet. He wouldn't face a life sentence, but he would still spend time behind bars for his role in Adam's death. The judge, taking into account the years of abuse Elena had endured and the circumstances of the case, sentenced Isaac to several years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving part of his sentence. It was a punishment that reflected the gravity of what had happened while acknowledging the unique and tragic context surrounding the incident. Elena broke down in tears as the sentence was read. She was relieved that Isaac wasn't going to spend the rest of his life in prison, but the reality of losing her brother, even for a few years, weighed heavily on her. She had already lost so much: her freedom, her sense of security, and now her family was once again being torn apart. Isaac remained composed, though the relief in his eyes was clear. He had prepared himself for the worst, and while this outcome wasn't ideal, it was better than what he had feared. In the days following the trial, the community reacted to the verdict in various ways. Some believed that justice had been served, that Isaac had done what he had to do to protect his sister, and that the law had recognized the complexity of the situation. Others felt that Isaac had gotten off too lightly, that taking a man's life, even an abuser's, deserved a harsher punishment. Elena, now free from Adam's control, faced the difficult task of rebuilding her life. The emotional scars of her abuse would take years to heal, and without Isaac by her side, she felt more alone than ever. She began attending therapy sessions, hoping to work through the trauma of both her marriage and the trial. Isaac, meanwhile, entered prison with the support of his family and legal team, knowing that his time behind bars was temporary, but the impact of that night would last a lifetime. As the legal process ended, Detective Harper reflected on the case. He had seen countless domestic violence cases over the years, but this one had left a lasting mark. It had shown the painful consequences of abuse and the difficult choices that families often face when trapped in such dangerous situations. Harper knew that there were no true winners in this case, only a tragedy that had unfolded after years of suffering. Elena returned to her now empty home, filled with memories of both the good and bad times she had shared with Adam. Although his abusive behavior had led to his violent end, there were still moments of their marriage that made her feel conflicted. The pain of losing her husband in such a tragic way haunted her, even though she knew Isaac had acted to protect her. Grief mingled with guilt, and she found herself reliving that night over and over in her mind, wondering how things might have turned out differently. Meanwhile, Isaac prepared to serve his sentence. Though the manslaughter conviction had spared him from a much harsher punishment, the reality of prison life loomed large. He knew that what he had done, though fueled by the desire to protect his sister, had changed his life forever. Every decision he had made that night now led him to this point. Isaac found solace in knowing that his actions had likely saved Elena from further harm, but that didn't erase the consequences of taking another man's life. He struggled with the weight of it all, unsure of how he would come to terms with the events that had transpired. Elena began therapy, seeking help for the years of abuse she had endured. As the days passed, she realized that it wasn't just Adam's physical violence that had scarred her, but the emotional control he had exerted over for so long. The isolation, the manipulation. It all began to make sense now. Therapy helped her uncover parts of herself that had been lost in the years of Adam's abuse. Slowly, she started to rebuild her life, but the shadow of that night lingered. It would take time for her to heal fully, and even then, the scars would remain. The community reacted to the trial's outcome in a mix of relief and controversy. Some people believed that Isaac had done what was necessary to save his sister, and the law had been merciful in acknowledging the context of domestic abuse. Others, however, felt that taking a life, no matter the reason, deserved a stricter punishment. The case had brought to light the complexities of self-defense, family loyalty, and domestic violence, sparking conversations about how the legal system should handle cases like Isaac. Detective Harper, who had been deeply involved in the investigation, reflected on the case with a heavy heart. As a seasoned officer, he had seen his fair share of tragedies, but something about this case stayed with him. The years of Elena's silent suffering, Isaac's desperate act of protection, and the slow unraveling of the truth had left an indelible mark on him. He had wanted justice for everyone involved, but he knew there were no true winners in the situation. Adam's death was a tragedy, as were the shattered lives left behind in its wake. As Isaac served his sentence, he remained determined to move forward, knowing that someday he would be free again. He received letters from Elena regularly, updates on her progress and reminders of how much she loved and appreciated him for what he had done. Though they had been separated by the legal system, the bond between them remained unbroken. Isaac found strength in that, knowing that despite everything, he had done what he believed was right in the heat of the moment. Elena, too, found solace in writing letters to Isaac. It gave her a sense of connection and purpose as she continued to heal from the years of abuse. In the quiet moments of her day, she often thought of the future, of the day when Isaac would be free again, and they could both leave the darkness of that fateful night behind them. Though it was far off, that hope kept her going, giving her the strength to rebuild her life piece by piece. As the years passed, Elena eventually moved away from the town where everything had happened, seeking a fresh start. Though her past would never fully leave her, she was determined to carve out a new life, one where the fear and violence of her previous relationship no longer controlled her. She kept in touch with Isaac, who had made it through his sentence with the same determination to move forward. The time apart had given them both space to heal, but they remained connected by the shared trauma of what had happened. When Isaac was finally released, the reunion between brother and sister was bittersweet. They had both been through so much: years of abuse, the violent end to Adam's life, the trial, and Isaac's imprisonment. But as they stood together again, there was a sense of relief. They had both survived. The years had not been kind, but they had made it to the other side. In the end, the story of Isaac and Elena became a cautionary tale of the devastating effects of domestic violence. It was a reminder of the complexities involved when family and violence intersect, and how even in acts of protection, the consequences can be far-reaching. Their story became a symbol of survival, of the difficult choices people sometimes have to make to protect the ones they love. Though the case had concluded and life had moved on, the emotional impact of that night would forever remain. Isaac and Elena, though forever changed, found a way to start anew, carrying with them the lessons of their past as they tried to build a better future.